Baptist Church, and welcome to episode 8 of our study on Galatians. We're going to try to make this one a little quicker than last time. I went over last time much longer than I wanted to, but we're starting chapter 3 this episode, and we're probably going to try to get through verse 9. So chapter 3, verse 1 through 9, and let's go ahead and jump right on into this. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. Let me ask you only this: did you receive the Spirit by works of the law, or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? Did you suffer so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? Does he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you do so by works of the law, or by hearing with faith? Just as Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Know then that it is those of faith who are sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, In you shall the nations be blessed. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. All right, here we have a change of tone in Paul. If we recall what we've been the last several episodes, Paul's been on a defensive. He's justifying himself, he's justifying his teaching, he's justifying his ministry. Now Paul switches to the offense. He's done playing defense. He's going on the attack now. And he starts off, ESV says, "Oh, foolish Galatians." NET, "You foolish Galatians." If we look over here in that far right, on the Greek here, we got o anna etoi. That omega symbol, which you may have seen on alpha omega symbols. You've probably seen this somewhere in the church, at least at Hartford Baptist. Whenever we see that, it's a vocative address. This is similar to a letter in English we'd write to somebody. If I was writing a letter to my wife, I may start with "Dear Amber." What Paul has done here, he's literally said, well, before we do that, let's look at that second word, anaitoi. Foolishness, we see here that both translations do. We kind of take that, we could use that as silly. That's not that strong of a word. Oh, you silly Galatians. Now, this is actually a pretty forceful word. Let's look it up in a Greek lexicon here, see what this one says. Pertaining to the unwillingness to use one's mental faculties in order to understand. Foolish, stupid, without understanding. It's a pretty strong word. It doesn't mean foolish in the sense of silly. He's like, you are a stubborn person refusing to use your mental capabilities to understand. Paul essentially said, "Dear stupid Galatians" here. He is aggressive. He is strong worded here, and it's not that he's saying they have a low IQ. He's saying that they're refusing to use spiritual discernment. This is one of the worst spots and most dangerous spots for a believer to be in. Is where the Galatians are. They are the spiritual divorced from the doctrinal. And we can do that today, where we emphasize the experience of being a Christian over the theology of being a Christian. Where do we get doctrine? Where do we get theology? We get that from Scripture. We get that from the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of Paul, but also the teachings of the Old Testament. We've got to see how those fit together. The Galatians had apparently gotten the habit of listening to the false teachers, just taking the man's word for it. That'd be like us listening to me or Pastor Jason and just taking our word for it. We're not verifying. So in the words of Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. That's what doctrine is all about. It is basically keeping us in check to make sure our lives are in accordance to Scripture. And if we fail to do that, the Spirit moving in us and leading us can be easily confused with our emotions. So how do we discern between our emotions? Is this my emotions leading me, or is this the Spirit leading me? Scripture helps us discern that. Continuing on, verse 1 still. Who has bewitched you? Of course, he says singular. We know overall argument of the letter, it's the false teachers, but Paul uses the singular there. Who has bewitched you? So what is he talking about there? It's a single who. It could be stylistic. where he's just referring to he's just using it to be for style. Or it could be referring to something similar he said in 2 Corinthians. I think it's, no, it's chapter 11, not 9. Here we go. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from sincere and pure devotion to Christ. What I think Paul's talking about here, I think when he says the who, why he isn't saying there's not false teachers in the church leading you astray. I think he's pointing back to where all false teaching and deception comes from. That's from the evil one. That's the serpent, Satan. Just as he led Eve astray, he is leading us astray through false teachers. And notice these false teachers aren't outside the church. These false teachers are inside the church of Galatia, and certainly they're inside the church today. If you look at just the history of the Christian church, we handle persecution from outside the church much better than we do false teachers inside the church. It's when Christian leaders get inside of the four walls and we start listening to them that we get led astray, and the church really, really, truly suffers, loses its gospel focus, loses evangelical focus. And that's by the people who we invite into our church to speak. Those are the ones who do the real damage. It's not the governments. Church has always thrived under government persecution. Even in China, the church is thriving despite severe persecution from the Chinese government. But continuing on, verse 1, it was before your eyes that Jesus was publicly portrayed and crucified. Here the ESV makes it sound like they were witnesses to Jesus' crucifixion, which some of them may have been. I'm not saying they're not. But Paul could also be trying to say this in a different way. Look at the NET in that middle column. Before your eyes, Jesus was vividly portrayed as crucified. What I think is more likely, Paul is saying that when we preached the gospel to you, we vividly told you the story of Jesus crucified. Of course, there could be somebody in the church that was an actual witness to the crucifixion, but more likely, Paul is talking about the actual preaching of that gospel, and Paul preaching it in a vividly way, in a detailed way. Verse 2, let me ask you only this. NET, I think, captures the Greek better. It says, the only thing I want you to learn. It's because Paul's trying to teach him a lesson. He wants him to learn something. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing in faith? How were you saved? Were you saved by the Spirit through works or by faith? Are you so foolish, having begun by the Spirit? So he gave him the answer there. Your salvation originated in the Spirit, but now you think you can be perfected by the flesh? And here is the faith plus works that's being taught to the church of Galatia. Now that, you need faith in Jesus, but you also got to have these works. You're not a real Christian unless you keep the works of the law. You've got to be circumcised. You've got to obey the kosher diet. You've got to obey the Sabbath laws. You've got to do this, or it's not sufficient, is what the church of Galatia is being told. And that's why Paul is so furious. As we're going to see, as Paul's going to make abundantly clear as the letter progresses, faith plus works is not the saving gospel. It's faith alone that is the saving gospel. But with that being said, James, and this is kind of a homework for you, James chapter 2, verse 14-21. I'm not going to read it to you, but I will pop it up on the screen so you can see it and know where to go to. But James chapter 2, you see the heading there, faith without works is dead. And James goes on to talk about in this passage, about the necessity of works. Well, Paul seems to be in Galatians teaching it's not about works. So I guess my homework for you, and I'm going to talk, the next episode, I'm going to talk about it, but we'll let you investigate that first. Read James chapter 2, verses 14 through 21, and kind of compare that to what we're reading in Galatians chapter 3. And Martin Luther believed for a while that James was contradicting Paul. Martin Luther called James an epistle of straw. He was confused by it. He was trying to unlearn his Catholic teaching, and he didn't like what James was saying. But Martin Luther figured it out, what James was really saying. But read this next day or two and see what you think. What is James really saying here? Is he saying you need works to be saved? We just kind of think about that. But going back to our passage in Galatians, let's go, let's, for sake of time, let's go to, let's start in verse 5. Does he who supplies the Spirit to you and work miracles among you do so by works of the law or by hearing with faith? So again, how did you get the Spirit? How have these miracles been done? Everything that God has done for you, is it through faith, or is it rewarding you for doing the works of the law? Verse 6. Now Paul's getting so he's bringing up the Old Testament here. He's making a strong, great point. Just as Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. Here we have what Paul's referring to is in the Old Testament, where Abraham was declared righteous before the law was given. He was declared righteous before he was circumcised. And how was he declared righteous? He was declared righteous because of his faith. So Paul's saying it's always been about faith. You have never been declared righteous by works of the law. It is since the days of Abraham. Paul's given a good example from Abraham. Abraham was even declared righteous by faith. And then here's a verse 7. Know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. There's a kind of a sister passage to this in Romans 9, 9:7. No, if I type in 9 right. Paul says, and not all those are children of Abraham because they are his offspring. So Paul's saying there, not all descendants of Abraham are truly descendants of Abraham. They're not children of Abraham. And in Galatians, he's telling us the other half of this. He's telling us who are the sons and the children of Abraham, and it's those of faith. To be a son of Abraham isn't about being a descendant of. You don't need to have Abraham's DNA in you to be a son of Abraham. It is about faith. This is a mistake that some of the dispensationalists make, where they want to portray the blessings of Abraham are still upon and need to be fulfilled upon the genetic descendants of Abraham. Well, Paul's saying a descendant of Abraham, or a son of Abraham, isn't a physical offspring. That's not who gets the blessings of Abraham. And we're going to read, and that's exactly what Paul's saying here. Going back to verse 8, and the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith. So even in the Old Testament, God's hinting that even the Gentiles will be saved by faith. Preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall the nations be blessed. So here we have that the nations, the Gentiles, if they are sons of Abraham through faith, they will receive the blessings of Abraham. And that's something that the dispensationals, I think, overlook. That God's kingdom is not those blessings are not promised to physical people. Of course, in the Old Testament, we see that initially being handed down to the physical descendants of Abraham, because it was the physical descendants of Abraham who had faith at the time. It wasn't, the Canaanites who had faith. It wasn't the Philistines who had faith in God. It was the physical descendants of Abraham had the faith in God. Well, now we see it's expanded out. It's expanded to the Gentile nations, and those blessings are shared with all those in the faith, not all those who are physically descended from Abraham. Verse 9, so then, those who are of the faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. Just confirming what we said, that those in the faith, those of faith, are blessed with Abraham. It is about, to be a child of Abraham is to have the faith of Abraham in the God of Abraham. And through that, we receive those blessings that is taught through, well, you see the completion of that, the consummation in the book of Revelation, new heaven, new earth. The bridegroom is united with the bride, which is the church. All this sees the fulfillment in the New Testament church. And okay, we're going to wrap it up there. I think we may have done a little bit better in our time, but just read James chapter 2, verses 14-21, and see what you think. Does James contradict Paul? And we'll answer that question next episode.